London, April 12th, 1815. The hour approached 9 o'clock in the evening, and the Chamberlain ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames reflected endlessly in the gilt-edged mirrors lining walls papered in cream silk. This was the opening night of the spring season, that glittering parade of marriageable young ladies and discerning gentlemen, and every person of consequence had assembled to observe, to judge, to secure advantageous matches. Clara Fairfax stood in her customary position, beside the potted palms near the east wall, a location she had claimed through 6 long seasons of polite invisibility. Her gown tonight was pale lavender, a color her mother had declared suitable for a woman of 26 years, too old for the virginal whites of debutantes, too unmarried for the rich jewel tones of matrons. The fabric whispered against her skin as she shifted her weight, holding her dance card with its mortifying expanse of blank spaces. She had long ago mastered the art of appearing pleasantly occupied while utterly alone, her face arranged in an expression of mild interest as she watched the kaleidoscope of silk and superficial conversation swirl past her like a river around a stone. Across the room, her sister Eleanor, now Lady Ashford, laughed at something a gentleman said, her hand resting possessively on her husband's arm, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of having secured her place in society. Eleanor had made it abundantly clear that Clara's continued presence at such events reflected poorly on the family, a silent reproach in expensive clothing, a reminder of failure. Their mother, Mrs. Margaret Fairfax, had ceased even looking in Clara's direction at these gatherings, her disappointment having long ago calcified into resigned indifference. Clara understood their perspective with a clarity that sometimes stole her breath. She was past the age when hope was fashionable. 6 seasons without a single proposal, without even sustained interest from any gentleman of quality or fortune. She had watched younger women arrive, bloom, and depart into matrimony while she remained, year after year, fading into the wallpaper like a figure in an old painting. Yet beneath the resignation lived something stubbornly vital, a keen intelligence that observed everything, that understood the intricate social machinery around her with pitiless accuracy. She saw how beauty purchased forgiveness for stupidity, how fortune excused rudeness, how youth itself was currency that spent down with each passing month. She noticed Lord Hastings's wandering eye, despite his devoted wife, observed Miss Pembroke's calculated cruelty dressed as concern, recognized the desperate gaiety in mothers with multiple unmarried daughters. Clara had become a student of the ballroom because she could not be a participant, and this knowledge, while sharp, offered no comfort. The orchestra began tuning for the next set, and she felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the anticipation of remaining unasked, the dignity required to smile as though it were her choice to stand among the palms, alone. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel, and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The evening had settled into its rhythm of predictable patterns when Clara noticed the shift in the room's attention, a subtle turning of heads toward the refreshment table where 2 gentlemen stood in what appeared to be polite conversation, though the tension between them was evident even from her distant vantage point. She recognized one immediately as Alexander Thornhill, the Earl of Westbrook, a man whose reputation for measured deliberation and penetrating intelligence preceded him into every gathering, his tall frame and dark hair distinctive even in this crowd of peacocks. And the other was Lord Philip Redmond, whose charm was as famous as his string of failed investments and gambling debts, though society politely pretended not to notice such vulgarities when a man possessed a handsome face and easy manners. Clara watched as Philip's eyes swept the ballroom with what seemed like calculated intent before they landed inexplicably on her, and she looked away quickly, certain she had misread his attention. But when she dared glance back, he was walking directly toward her position by the palms, his smile bright and purposeful in a way that made her heart stutter with confusion and something dangerously close to hope. He stopped before her with a bow that was perfectly executed, his golden hair catching the candlelight, his blue eyes fixed on hers with an intensity she had never before experienced from any gentleman in 6 long seasons. "Miss Fairfax," he said, his voice pitched to carry just far enough that nearby conversations faltered, "I find myself unforgivably remiss in not having secured your company for this evening's dances, and I wonder if you might do me the very great honor of allowing me to claim the next 5 sets, if your card is not already filled." The question itself was absurd. They both knew her card was empty. The whole ballroom knew it. Yet he asked with such earnest formality that she could almost believe he genuinely desired her company rather than simply required a partner. Clara's fingers trembled as she extended the card, watching him inscribe his name in 5 consecutive spaces with bold, confident strokes, aware that whispers had begun rippling outward from their position like stones thrown into still water. She could see Louisa Pembroke's mouth forming a perfect circle of shock, could feel her mother's attention snap toward her for the first time all evening, could sense rather than see Eleanor's frantic mental calculations about what this unexpected development might mean for the family's social standing. Lord Redmond offered his arm for the next dance, and Clara took it with fingers that felt numb, her mind racing through possible explanations for this impossible turn of events, none of them sufficient to explain why a gentleman of his standing would suddenly notice her existence. What she could not see, positioned as she was with her back to the refreshment table, was the way Alexander Thornhill's hand had tightened around his glass of champagne, his jaw setting in a hard line as he watched Philip lead Clara toward the dance floor, or the way his closest friend, Thomas Sinclair, leaned close to murmur a question that went unanswered. Because Alexander's attention was entirely fixed on the peculiar tableau unfolding before him, recognition dawning with cold clarity that he was witnessing one of Philip's calculated games, though this time the unwitting participant was a woman who deserved far better than to be used as a pawn in their ongoing rivalry. The orchestra struck the opening notes of the waltz at precisely 10 o'clock, a melody in 3/4 time that seemed to shimmer through the candle-lit air like something tangible, and Philip Redmond extended his hand to Clara with a smile that would have convinced her of his sincerity had she not spent 6 seasons learning to read the subtle calibrations of social performance. She placed her gloved hand in his, feeling the warmth of his palm through the thin sill, and allowed him to lead her onto the floor where other couples were already assembling in the graceful formations required by this most intimate of dances, the waltz that had scandalized London when first introduced and still carried whispers of impropriety in the way it required a gentleman's hand at a lady's waist, their bodies closer than any other dance permitted. Philip's hand settled at the small of her back with practiced ease, his other hand clasping hers, and as they began to move, Clara felt something she had not experienced in 2 full years, not since the last time any gentleman had requested her company for a waltz, the particular joy of movement and music combining into something that transcended the awkwardness of her social position. She had forgotten how naturally dancing came to her body, how her feet seemed to know the patterns without conscious thought, how the rhythm entered through her skin and organized her movements with effortless precision, and she saw surprise flicker across Philip's face as he realized she was not the clumsy partner he might have expected from a woman so long relegated to the wallflower's exit. They turned and swept across the polished floor, her lavender skirts billowing gently with each rotation, and Clara felt the weight of watching eyes upon them, heard the whispers that formed a constant undercurrent beneath the music, saw in her peripheral vision the way Louisa Pembroke leaned close to her companion with lips moving in what could only be speculation or criticism. Philip maintained his performance of attentiveness with impressive consistency, his eyes on her face, his conversation light and flattering. Yet Clara noticed the way his gaze would drift past her shoulder at regular intervals, searching for something or someone in the crowd of observers, and she felt the first cold thread of doubt wind through her cautious happiness. What she could not see was Alexander Thornhill's position near the edge of the dance floor, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand, his attention fixed with unusual intensity on the turning couple, or the way his jaw had tightened until the muscle jumped beneath his skin, a tell that his closest friend Thomas Sinclair recognized immediately as a sign of strongly suppressed emotion. Thomas followed Alexander's gaze to where Philip Redmond guided the wallflower through the waltz with theatrical gallantry, and understanding dawned with uncomfortable clarity. Because he had witnessed Philip employ this particular strategy before, this use of an unexpected partner to provoke jealousy or assert dominance, though never with quite this edge of calculated cruelty. Alexander watched as Clara's face transformed during the dance, watched the way genuine pleasure softened features he had never truly noticed in 6 seasons of sharing ballrooms, watched grace emerge from a woman society had dismissed as graceless, and felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with his rivalry with Philip Redmond, and everything to do with the sudden recognition that he was witnessing something precious being used as a disposable pawn in a game she did not know she was playing. The third dance ended at 10:45 in the evening with a final flourish of strings, and Clara stepped back from Philip Redmond with a curtsy that felt mechanical despite her best efforts to maintain the facade of gracious pleasure, her body warm from the exertion of movement, her mind beginning to whisper uncomfortable questions about why this particular gentleman had chosen this particular evening to suddenly discover her existence among the wallflowers he had ignored for 6 consecutive seasons. She murmured something about needing a moment to compose herself, a polite fiction that society permitted ladies to employ when they required escape to the retiring room, and Philip released her with a bow and that brilliant smile that seemed somehow less brilliant than it had appeared an hour earlier, promising to return for their 4th dance in 15 minutes precisely. Clara made her way through the press of bodies toward the corridor that led to the ladies' retiring room, grateful for the relative coolness after the stifling heat of the ballroom, where hundreds of candles and moving bodies had raised the temperature to nearly unbearable levels. And as she passed through the doorway into the marble-tiled hallway, she heard voices drifting from around the corner near the potted fern. Louisa Pembroke's distinctive laugh, followed by words that struck like physical blows. "Poor, desperate creature," Louisa was saying to her companions in that carrying whisper designed to be overheard while maintaining plausible deniability. "Did you see how pathetically grateful she looked to finally have a gentleman's attention, as though Philip Redmond would ever seriously consider someone so utterly past her prime and plain besides?" And another voice chimed in with speculation about whether Clara had paid him, or perhaps her family had offered some inducement to rescue their spinster daughter from complete social death. Clara stopped walking, her hand finding the cool marble of the wall for support, and felt the familiar weight of shame settle across her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Yet beneath the shame something else stirred, something that whispered, this pain was old, and she had survived it before and would survive it again. That these cruel girls with their pretty faces and empty hearts could wound her, but could not destroy her essential dignity if she refused to surrender it. What she did not see was the tall figure of Alexander Thornhill standing motionless behind the marble column 10 feet to her left, positioned there by pure coincidence as he had stepped into this corridor, seeking a moment of quiet away from the suffocating ballroom, his body hidden by the column's width, but his view entirely clear of both the gossiping women and Clara's still figure absorbing their cruelty. He watched as she straightened her spine with visible effort, watched her hands smooth down the lavender silk of her gown in a gesture that spoke of hard-won composure, watched her lift her chin and continue walking past the corridor where Louisa and her companions continued their vicious speculation, never giving them the satisfaction of knowing she had heard, never allowing her dignity to crumble under the weight of their casual destruction. In that moment, Alexander understood with sudden crystalline clarity that he was witnessing courage of a kind society never celebrated, the quiet bravery of continuing to show oneself in spaces designed to humiliate, of refusing to disappear despite every message that one's presence was unwelcome. And he felt something shift in his chest that transformed his intention from mere intervention in Philip's game to something far more personal and profound. Alexander Thornhill retreated from the marble column at 11:15 in the evening with the careful deliberation of the man who had reached a decision that would alter the trajectory of his carefully ordered life, and he found Thomas Sinclair precisely where he expected to find him. Near the card-room entrance with a glass of brandy and an expression of mild boredom that characterized his friend's attitude toward most social gatherings that did not involve gambling or significantly more interesting conversation than these balls typically provided. Thomas looked up as Alexander approached, and something in his friend's face must have communicated the gravity of his thoughts, because Thomas straightened immediately, the boredom replaced by alert curiosity, and gestured toward a relatively quiet alcove away from the main press of bodies where they might speak without being overheard by the tireless gossips who populated every corner of these gatherings like particularly well-dressed spies. Alexander led the way to the alcove, positioning himself where he could still observe the ballroom through the gap in the curtains. And Thomas waited with the patience of long friendship for Alexander to organize whatever thoughts had produced that particular quality of focused intensity that Thomas had learned over 15 years of association meant his friend was about to do something either remarkably brilliant or spectacularly insane, the line between the two often being considerably thinner than most people assumed. "I am going to do something unprecedented," Alexander said finally, his voice low and measured, as he watched Philip Redmond escort Clara Fairfax back onto the floor for their fourth dance, watched the way she held herself with such careful dignity, despite the exhaustion visible in the slight stiffness of her movements. And Thomas made a non-committal sound that encouraged continuation without committing to either approval or disapproval until he possessed more information about what unprecedented action his friend was contemplating. Alexander turned from his observation to meet Thomas's eyes directly, and Thomas saw in that gaze something he had seen only twice before. The absolute certainty that preceded the kind of action that society would either celebrate or condemn depending entirely on the outcome, and he felt his pulse quicken with the anticipation that always accompanied Alexander's rare moments of throwing caution and calculation aside in favor of pure instinct. "I am going to purchase every remaining dance on Miss Fairfax's card for the rest of the season," Alexander stated as though he were discussing nothing more significant than the weather, and Thomas felt his eyebrows rise toward his hairline in involuntary surprise, because even by Alexander's standards, this was extraordinarily bold, a public declaration that would bind him socially as surely as a formal betrothal announcement and leave no room whatsoever for retreat or reconsideration. Thomas opened his mouth to ask if his friend had lost his senses, then closed it again as he saw Alexander's gaze drift back to where Clara moved through the figures of the dance, saw the quality of attention in that gaze, and understood with sudden clarity that this was not primarily about Philip Redmond or their long-standing rivalry, though that element certainly played its part, but rather about the woman herself, about something Alexander had seen or recognized that had transformed her from invisible wallflower to someone worthy of this most public and irreversible of commitments. She does not deserve to be used as a pawn in Philip's games, Alexander continued, his voice carrying an edge of something that might have been anger, or might have been something softer and more complex. And she has more courage and dignity in her smallest finger than Louisa Pembroke and her entire circle possess in their collective being, and Thomas heard in those words the echo of some observation or encounter that had clearly affected his friend more profoundly than Alexander's carefully neutral tone was attempting to convey. The fifth dance concluded at 11:45 in the evening, with Philip Redmond bowing over Clara's hand with theatrical flourish that suggested he believed himself to be performing a great kindness rather than executing a calculated maneuver. And Clara felt the exhaustion settling into her bones like winter cold, the emotional rawness of this extraordinary and bewildering evening, having stripped away the protective numbness she had cultivated over 6 long seasons of invisibility and dismissal. She murmured her thanks for the dances with what she hoped was appropriate graciousness, her mind already reaching toward the sanctuary of home and the privacy of her small bedroom, where she might finally allow herself to examine the confusing tangle of hope and suspicion and remembered cruelty that this evening had woven around her heart. And she was turning toward where her mother sat among the chaperones when a tall figure stepped directly into her path with the kind of deliberate intention that commanded immediate attention from everyone within visual range. Alexander Thornhill, Earl of Westbrook, stood before her with his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat, and she registered dimly that the conversations around them were faltering and dying as society's ever-vigilant observers recognized that something significant was occurring, something that would provide material for gossip and speculation for weeks to come. "Miss Fairfax," he said in that low, measured voice that carried nonetheless to every straining ear in their vicinity, and his formal bow was perfectly correct, yet somehow invested with a quality of respect that she had never experienced from any gentleman of his standing in all her 26 years. She managed a curtsy that she hoped did not betray the trembling that had begun in her legs, and watched in mounting confusion as he held out his hand in silent request for the small dance card that hung from her wrist on its lavender ribbon, the card that still showed one remaining dance for this evening, and countless empty slots for all the balls and assemblies that would fill the remaining weeks of the season. She surrendered it to him with fingers that shook despite her best efforts at composure, and felt the world narrow to just the sight of his long fingers holding her pathetically empty card, the silence that had fallen over their immediate area now spreading like ripples on a pond, as more and more people registered that the Earl of Westbrook was approaching the wallflower Clara Fairfax with unmistakable purpose and unprecedented public attention. "I should like to claim every remaining dance on your card, Miss Fairfax," Alexander said clearly, his words dropping into the silence like stones into still water, "not merely for this evening, but for every ball and assembly for the remainder of the season, if you will do me the very great honor of accepting my request." Clara felt the words impact her consciousness without quite achieving meaning, felt her mouth open slightly in shock, while somewhere to her left she heard Philip Redmond make a sound like he had been struck by. And she watched as Alexander produced a pen from his jacket with the kind of foresight that suggested this was no impulsive gesture, but rather a carefully considered decision executed with full awareness of its implications and consequences. The orchestra began the supper waltz at midnight precisely, and Clara found herself moving toward Alexander Thornhill with legs that felt as insubstantial as silk thread, her mind still struggling to comprehend what had just occurred while every eye in the ballroom followed her progress across the polished floor, and she was aware with acute clarity that her lavender gown, which had seemed so safe and invisible merely 3 hours earlier, now felt impossibly conspicuous against the sea of pastels and whites that surrounded them like judgmental clouds. Alexander's hand extended toward her with steady certainty that contrasted sharply with the trembling she could not quite control in her own fingers, and when his palm closed around hers, she felt the warmth of his skin through both their gloves, felt something pass between them that was more than mere physical contact, and she registered with distant surprise that his hand was larger than Philip's had been, his grip both gentler and somehow more secure. He drew her into the proper position for the waltz with movements that spoke of years of flawless training, and then his other hand settled at her waist with a pressure that was both respectful and unmistakably possessive. And Clara discovered that she fit against him with an ease that made her breath catch, because she stood at precisely the right height that she need not crane her neck uncomfortably upward, nor feel herself towering as she had with shorter partners in seasons past. The music swelled, and they began to move. And Clara was aware of the scent of him wrapping around her senses, something clean and masculine with undertones of sandalwood that was nothing like the heavy cloying cologne Philip had worn, and she found herself drawing that scent deeper into her lungs as though it might anchor her to this impossible moment. "You are trembling," Alexander said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone while they turned through the first measures, and his dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and somehow protected from all the staring faces that ringed them in avid curiosity. "I confess, I do not understand what just happened," Clara heard herself say with an honesty that horrified her even as the words emerged, and she saw something shift in his expression, something that might have been approval or might have been tenderness. "Philip Redmond was using you to provoke me," Alexander said, with a bluntness that should have been shocking, but instead felt oddly respectful of her intelligence. "We have a long-standing rivalry, and he delights in these petty games, but I could not stand by and watch him make you into a pawn for his amusement." The words struck her with the force of confirmation for what she had already half suspected, and Clara felt something curdle in her chest that might have been humiliation, except that Alexander's hand tightened fractionally at her waist, and he continued speaking before she could fully process the implications. "But that is not why I claimed every dance for the season," he said, and now his voice carried a quality she could not quite identify, something warmer and more personal than mere chivalrous intervention. "I did that because, in watching you tonight, I saw something that society has apparently been too blind to notice, and I found I could not bear the thought of you returning to invisibility, when you deserve so much more than these fools have offered you." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely, because she would not cry in front of all these watching people, would not give them that satisfaction. And she searched Alexander's face for any sign of pity or condescension, and found instead something that looked almost like wonder, and she realized with a shock that reverberated through her entire body that he was looking at her the way she had dreamed of being looked at for 6 long seasons, as though she were someone worth seeing. Clara woke on the morning of April 13th after perhaps 2 hours of fractured sleep that had been populated by dreams where she relived the waltz with Alexander over and over, except in the dreams his face kept transforming into expressions of mockery and pity until she startled awake in her narrow bed with her heart pounding and the grey dawn light seeping through her curtains like doubt made visible. She lay motionless under her quilts while the house stirred to life around her and tried to reconstruct the previous evening with some semblance of rational analysis, tried to understand why a wealthy, titled earl would bind himself publicly to every dance for an entire season with a woman society had long since dismissed as unmarriageable, and every explanation her exhausted mind produced circled back to either pity or some elaborate extension of his conflict with Philip Redmond that she could not quite pass. By 10 in the morning, she had forced herself from bed and dressed in her simplest morning gown of grey muslin that felt appropriately colorless for what she had convinced herself would be a day of waiting for the inevitable retraction, or the polite note explaining that last evening had been a misunderstanding, or perhaps a charitable impulse he now regretted in the cold light of morning. She descended to the breakfast room with her stomach knotted too tightly for food, and found her mother and sister Eleanor already seated at the table with expressions that made Clara stop in the doorway, because she had not seen her mother look at her with such avid interest in perhaps 4 years, not since the 3rd season, when hope had finally curdled into resigned disappointment. "Clara, darling," her mother said with a warmth that felt like a costume poorly fitted to her usual brisk dismissiveness, "do come sit down and tell us everything about the Earl of Westbrook." And Clara felt something cold settle in her chest, because this sudden maternal attention felt less like affection and more like the calculation of social advantage. Eleanor was watching her with an expression Clara could not quite read, something between genuine curiosity and the kind of reassessment one might give to a piece of furniture suddenly discovered to be valuable, and Clara moved to her usual chair, feeling like a stranger in her own morning room. Before she could formulate any response to her mother's demand for details, their butler Morrison entered, carrying a silver tray laden with calling cards that made Margaret Fairfax inhale sharply with satisfaction. And Clara watched in mounting unreality as he placed the tray on the table, revealing at least a dozen cards from people who had never once acknowledged her existence in 6 full seasons. The Earl of Westbrook's card lay on top, heavy cream stock with his crest embossed in the corner, and beneath it Clara could see names she recognized from society columns, gentlemen and ladies who had looked through her at balls as though she were merely part of the wallpaper. Morrison cleared his throat with the particular inflection that suggested more news was forthcoming, and informed them that the morning scandal sheets were already carrying mention of last evening's unprecedented scene, and Clara felt her brief flicker of hope extinguish completely, because of course this was the explanation. Alexander had created a spectacle, and now society's machinery was grinding forward with its usual appetite for scandal, and she was merely the convenient vehicle for whatever point he had been making to Philip Redmond and the watching ton. Morrison announced the Earl of Westbrook at precisely 2 in the afternoon, with an inflection that conveyed both approval and vindication, as though he personally felt validated by having such a prestigious caller cross their threshold. And Clara rose from the drawing-room settee, where she had been sitting in rigid anticipation for the past hour, while her mother fussed with flower arrangements, and her sister Eleanor had arrived with suspicious promptness, claiming a need to visit, though she had not called socially in 3 months. Alexander entered the room with the same steady composure he had displayed at the ball, dressed impeccably in a dark blue coat that made his shoulders appear impossibly broad, and buckskin breeches that spoke of a man who had no need to prove his status through excessive ornamentation. And Clara felt her breath catch in exactly the way it had during their waltz, as his dark eyes found hers immediately, despite her mother's effusive greeting that filled the space with unnecessary words about honor and pleasure and gratitude. "Miss Fairfax," Alexander said with a slight bow that was perfectly calibrated to formal courtesy, while his gaze held a warmth that seemed intended for her alone. "I hope I am not calling at an inconvenient time," and Clara managed to find her voice enough to assure him that his timing was perfectly acceptable, even as her mother practically pushed her back onto the settee and rang for tea with an enthusiasm that would have been mortifying under any other circumstance. Alexander took the chair opposite Clara, with movements that suggested he was entirely comfortable in drawing rooms, despite his title suggesting he likely spent more time in far grander spaces, and Margaret Fairfax positioned herself in the chair between them at an angle that allowed her to observe every expression while maintaining the fiction of chaperoning rather than openly eavesdropping. And Eleanor perched on the window seat with unusual quietness, as though even she recognized this was a scene requiring careful attention. "I wanted to speak with you today about last evening," Alexander began once the tea had been served, with Margaret's trembling hands betraying her excitement as she poured, "because I realized after our waltz that I may have acted with more drama than explanation, and I would not have you spend even one day uncertain of my intentions or motivations." Clara wrapped her fingers around her teacup to give them something to hold besides each other, and forced herself to meet his gaze with as much directness as she could summon, while her heart hammered against her ribs, and she was aware of her mother's sharp intake of breath at this unprecedented frankness. But Alexander seemed unconcerned with propriety when it came to clarity of communication. "You said that Philip Redmond was using me," Clara said with a steadiness that surprised her. "And I appreciate your honesty in that regard. But I confess I am still uncertain why you chose to respond in such a public and binding manner, when surely a quiet word would have sufficed to end his game." Alexander set down his own teacup untouched and leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees in a posture that was informal enough to feel intimate despite the watching chaperones, and Clara saw something in his expression that looked almost like nervousness, though surely an earl had no reason to be nervous in the drawing room of a family so far beneath his social standing. "Because stopping Philip was only part of my motivation," Alexander said quietly, and I found I did not want to be quiet about the other part, and Clara felt her pulse accelerate to a pace that seemed unsustainable as he continued speaking with words that fell into the room like stones into still water. "I would like your permission to court you properly, Miss Fairfax, with drives in the park and attendance at the theatre, and yes, dances at every ball this season, as I rather dramatically committed myself to last evening. But I want you to agree to this, knowing that my interest is not charitable nor tactical, but genuinely personal. And I will understand if you need time to consider whether you wish to accept the attention of someone who makes such spectacles of his romantic intentions." The afternoon of April 15th arrived with the kind of crystalline spring weather that seemed designed specifically for display in Hyde Park during the fashionable hour, and Clara stood before her mirror in a walking dress of deep emerald green that her mother had commissioned with unseemly haste from the modiste on Bond Street, the fabric finer than anything Clara had worn in perhaps 3 years, and she barely recognized the woman looking back at her with color high in her cheeks and something that might have been hope brightening her grey eyes. Alexander arrived precisely at 5 with a curricle of gleaming black lacquer drawn by a perfectly matched pair of bay horses that made Eleanor emit an undignified sound of envy from where she watched through the drawing-room window, and when he handed Clara up onto the seat with his bare hand touching hers for the brief moment before she settled her skirts, she felt that same jolt of awareness that had marked their waltz 3 evenings prior. The park was thronged with society taking their daily parade along Rotten Row, ladies in their finest day dresses perched beside gentlemen who guided high-stepping horses with studied casualness. And Clara felt every eye turn toward them as Alexander directed his bays into the stream of traffic, with the kind of easy competence that suggested he could handle far more spirited cattle than this well-trained pair. "Miss Fairfax," Alexander said as they joined the promenade at a pace that allowed for conversation while still requiring his attention to the horses, "I hope you will tell me if this exposure becomes too overwhelming, as I am aware that sudden visibility can be as exhausting as it is gratifying," and Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at his perceptiveness, because he was correct that the weight of dozens of gazes felt almost physical against her skin. She was formulating a response when she spotted Louisa Pembroke riding in an open barouche with 2 other young ladies who had been part of the cruel chorus in the corridor at Lady Chamberlain's ball, and where before Louisa had looked through Clara as though she were invisible. Now her expression shifted into something calculating and falsely warm as she called out a greeting that Alexander returned with cool politeness that managed to be perfectly proper while conveying absolute dismissal. They had progressed perhaps 100 yards further when Philip Redmond appeared on a showy chestnut gelding that was fighting its bit, and Clara felt Alexander's posture shift almost imperceptibly beside her into something more alert and protective as Philip maneuvered his mount alongside the curricle with the kind of deliberate intrusion that forced other vehicles to make way. "Westbrook," Philip said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "What a charming picture you make. And Miss Fairfax, I trust you are enjoying your sudden elevation to object of interest, though I wonder how long such interest can be sustained when the novelty inevitably fades." Clara felt ice slide down her spine at the thinly veiled threat in his words. But before she could formulate any response, Alexander spoke with a voice that carried, despite its quietness. His tone conversational but edged with steel that made Philip's horse startle sideways. "I would caution you against mistaking your own inconstancy for a universal condition, Redmond, as some of us are capable of recognizing value that is not dependent on fashion or whim, and I believe you have other engagements that require your attention elsewhere." Philip's expression flickered with something ugly before he schooled it back into false pleasantness and wheeled his horse away with more force than necessary, and Clara released a breath she had not realized she was holding as Alexander continued guiding his bays forward as though nothing of consequence had occurred, though she could see the tension in his jaw and the whiteness of his knuckles where he gripped the reins. The evening of April 20th arrived with the kind of anticipation that made Clara change her gown 3 times before settling on a silk of deep sapphire blue that Eleanor had pronounced acceptable with a critical eye that held more genuine sisterly interest than Clara had experienced in perhaps 5 years. And when Alexander arrived to collect them for the theatre, his expression upon seeing her made warmth flood through her chest in a way that felt dangerous and exhilarating in equal measure. Drury Lane was ablaze with lights when they arrived, the grand theatre filled with society arranged in their boxes like jewels in a display case, and Clara was acutely aware of the eyes that followed their progress to the box Alexander had secured, its position perfectly situated to see and be seen in that particular economy of visibility that governed ton gatherings. Eleanor positioned herself at the rear of the box with the studied disinterest of a chaperone who had decided her duty extended to presence but not interference, and Alexander held Clara's chair with an attentiveness that spoke of genuine care rather than mere propriety. And when his hand brushed her shoulder as he settled her wrap, it took conscious effort not to lean into the touch. The play was A Midsummer Night's Dream, which Clara had read perhaps a dozen times but never seen performed, and she found herself leaning forward with unguarded delight as the fairy court materialized on stage in a shimmer of gauze and clever lighting, and she was so absorbed in Puck's mischievous machinations that she startled when Alexander leaned close enough that she could feel the warmth of him and said quietly, "You know this play well, I think," and she turned to find him watching her face rather than the stage with an expression that made her pulse accelerate in that now familiar way. "I have always loved Shakespeare," Clara admitted with a honesty that felt easier in the dimness of the box, where the stage lights threw shadows across his features. "Though I confess the comedies more than the tragedies, as I have never been able to stomach the idea that love must end in death to be meaningful." And Alexander smiled with what looked like genuine pleasure as he replied that he shared her preference for stories where wit and persistence triumphed over fate and circumstance. The intermission brought the usual parade of acquaintances to their box, society paying its respects with a mixture of genuine warmth and calculating interest, and Clara found herself handling the attention with an ease that surprised her as she made polite conversation about the performances and deflected the more intrusive questions, with the kind of gentle firmness she had not known she possessed. When they were finally alone again, save for Eleanor's dutiful presence, Alexander turned to her with a seriousness that contrasted with the frivolity still echoing from the corridor outside, and said, "I want to tell you something about my family, if you are willing to hear it." And Clara nodded as her heart did something complicated behind her ribs, because this felt like a threshold being crossed into deeper territory than they had yet explored. "My mother was Lady Catherine Thornhill before her marriage," Alexander said quietly, his gaze fixed on his hands where they rested on the edge of the box, "and she was considered one of the great beauties of her generation. But what I remember most about her was that she read voraciously, and taught me that intelligence and kindness mattered more than any accident of appearance or birth, and she died when I was 19, believing that I would find someone who valued those same qualities when the time came to marry." Clara felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes as she understood what he was offering her with this confidence, this window into the formation of the man he had become. And she found her voice enough to say, "She would have been proud of you, I think." And Alexander turned to meet her gaze with an intensity that made the theatre and its hundreds of occupants fade into irrelevance as he replied, "I hope she would have liked you, because I find that matters to me more than I expected." Lady Ashford's garden party on the afternoon of April the 25th was held in the extensive grounds behind her townhouse, where elaborate parterres had been arranged with hothouse roses that perfumed the warm spring air, and Clara wore a day dress of soft pink muslin that her mother had declared appropriately modest, while Eleanor had pronounced it insipid before admitting grudgingly that the colour brought unexpected warmth to Clara's complexion. Alexander arrived precisely at 3 and found Clara standing near the rose arbour with a glass of lemonade in her hand, and the smile that transformed his usually composed features when their eyes met made something flutter dangerously in her chest, because she was learning to trust that such expressions were genuine rather than performative, though the fear of eventual disappointment still lurked in the corners of her newfound happiness. They had been conversing for perhaps 20 minutes about the merits of different rose varieties, with the kind of easy companionship that had developed between them when Louisa Pembroke approached in a confection of yellow silk that would have been better suited to a woman 5 years younger, her smile bright and false as she greeted Alexander with fluttering attention before turning to Clara with eyes that held calculation beneath their warmth. "Miss Fairfax," Louisa said with a laugh that had edges like cut glass, "how delightful to see you looking so well. Though I confess I was just saying to Lady Grayson that it is quite remarkable to witness a romance blossoming at such a mature age, as there is something rather desperate about attachments formed when one has quite given up hope, is there not?" Clara felt the words land like physical blows despite their delivery in a tone of false sweetness, felt the old familiar shame begin to rise in her throat, along with the instinct to shrink back into invisibility. But before she could formulate any response, Alexander spoke with a voice that carried despite its quietness, the tone conveying such withering disdain that Louisa actually took a step backward. "Miss Pembroke," Alexander said, as though addressing a particularly slow child, "I find your observation reveals far more about your own character than about Miss Fairfax, as it requires a peculiarly shallow mind to imagine that worth diminishes with age, or that genuine affection can only be found by those who have never experienced disappointment, and I would suggest that desperation is far more evident in those who mistake cruelty for wit, in a misguided attempt to elevate themselves through the diminishment of others." The small group that had gathered near enough to overhear fell into the kind of silence that precedes either scandal or social ruin, and Clara watched as Louisa's face cycled through shock and humiliation before settling into a rigid mask as she turned and walked away with less grace than she had arrived. And Clara realized she had dropped her glass of lemonade onto the grass where it lay on its side, leaking pale liquid into the emerald lawn. Alexander turned to her with concern, evident in the line between his brows, and said quietly, "I apologize if I have embarrassed you, but I find I cannot remain silent when those I value are subjected to such calculated unkindness." And Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, not from shame, but from the overwhelming recognition that he had just publicly declared her worthy of his protection in terms that left no doubt as to the sincerity of his regard. From the corner of her eye, Clara could see Eleanor watching with an expression that held something approximating pride, and beyond her sister, the assembled guests were whispering with the kind of energy that suggested this encounter would be repeated in drawing rooms across London before nightfall. But for once, Clara found she did not fear the gossip because Alexander stood beside her, with his hand hovering near her elbow in a gesture of support that spoke louder than any declaration. The afternoon of April 28th arrived with clouds massing on the horizon like a promise of drama to come. But Clara had become so accustomed to the regular pattern of Alexander's attentions that she dressed in Eleanor's borrowed riding habit of deep forest green without concern for the weather, her heart lifting as it always did now when she knew she would see him within the hour. Eleanor had proven surprisingly generous with the loan of both habit and horse. A gentle mare named Rosalind, who had patience for Clara's still developing skills in the saddle, and when Alexander arrived mounted on a magnificent bay gelding, his smile held a warmth that made Clara's breath catch, even after 16 days of courtship, that had begun to feel almost miraculous in their steady progression toward something she hardly dared name. They rode toward Richmond, with Eleanor trailing at the discreet distance a chaperone maintained when she wished to observe propriety while allowing conversation, and Clara found herself laughing with genuine delight as Alexander told her a story about his sister Diana's determination at age 12 to train a barn cat to perform tricks like the dog's, his usually composed features animated with affection that spoke of deep family bond. The first drops of rain came so suddenly that Clara gasped, and within moments what had been a gentle spring afternoon transformed into a downpour that sent Eleanor's horse skittering nervously while Alexander reached over to catch Rosalind's bridle with sure hands and called over the thunder that there was shelter ahead if they hurried. The folly appeared through the sheets of rain like something from a Gothic novel. An elaborate ruin built 50 years earlier, when such architectural follies had been fashionable, its partial roof and crumbling walls still sound enough to offer protection from the storm that now unleashed itself with enthusiastic fury. They dismounted in a stumbling rush and led the horses into what had once been the main chamber, and Clara found herself suddenly breathless, not from exertion, but from the awareness that she was truly alone with Alexander for the first time in their acquaintance, Eleanor having taken shelter in what remained of an adjoining room, with a tact that was either admirably proper or shockingly permissive, depending on interpretation. Alexander shrugged out of his riding coat, despite its soaked state, and moved to drape it around Clara's shoulders, and she caught the scent of him, rain and leather, and something warm beneath that made her pulse accelerate as his hands lingered perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "You are trembling," he said quietly, his face close enough that she could see the drops of water caught in his dark lashes, and Clara could not tell him that the trembling had little to do with cold and everything to do with the way he was looking at her in the dim light filtered through gaps in the ancient stone. The thunder rolled overhead, and Alexander raised one hand to brush a wet strand of hair from her cheek, his touch impossibly gentle, and Clara saw his gaze drop to her mouth with an intensity that made something coil tight in her chest. When he leaned toward her, she found herself rising to meet him as though drawn by forces beyond her control, and for one suspended moment his breath mingled with hers in the small space between them, before Eleanor's voice called from the adjoining room, asking if they were quite all right, and Alexander stepped back with visible effort, his jaw tight and his hands clenched at his sides. "We should return as soon as the storm passes," he said roughly, and Clara nodded because speech seemed impossible, but when their eyes met again, she saw promise there that made her willing to wait for whatever came next. Lord Hastings' ball on the evening of May the 1st promised to be among the most lavish events of the season, with the ballroom decorated in white roses and gold ribbon that caught the candlelight like captured sunshine. And Clara arrived in a gown of white silk that her mother had commissioned at considerable expense, the investment justified by the presence of the Earl of Westbrook, whose attentions had elevated Clara from invisible wallflower to one of the season's most discussed young ladies in the space of 19 days. Alexander had sent word that morning that he would be slightly delayed by business matters, but would claim the supper dance and all those that followed, and Clara felt secure enough in his regard that the delay caused only mild disappointment rather than the panic that would have consumed her weeks earlier when every slight seemed to confirm her worthlessness. She was standing near the refreshment table, speaking with Lady Grayson about the upcoming exhibition at Somerset House, when she noticed the whispers beginning at the far end of the ballroom, that particular quality of gossip that spreads like fire through dry brush, with each repetition adding embellishment until rumor becomes accepted truth. At first, Clara paid little attention because she had grown almost accustomed to being discussed, but then she caught fragments of conversation as guests passed, words like improper and alone and compromised spoken with the mix of scandal and delight that society reserved for falls from grace. Her hands went cold around her glass of orgeat as Mrs. Pemberton swept past with her daughters and said loudly enough to be overheard that she had always known there was something desperate about attachments formed at such an advanced age, and dear Lord Westbrook had no doubt been trapped by circumstances into continuing an association he might otherwise have reconsidered. Clara set down her glass with shaking hands and moved toward the terrace doors because she suddenly could not breathe in the overheated ballroom, and as she passed the card room, she heard Philip Redmond's voice carrying with calculated clarity as he told Lord Hastings that it was unfortunate about the riding accident that had required Westbrook and Miss Fairfax to take shelter alone for the better part of an hour, and while he was certain nothing improper had occurred, it did put the Earl in a rather difficult position regarding the continuation of their courtship. The words landed like physical blows because Clara understood with devastating clarity that Philip had somehow learned of the folly and the rainstorm and was using that innocent incident to destroy what she had begun to believe might actually be real. And she felt the old familiar shame rising in her throat, along with the certainty that Alexander would now be forced either to propose from obligation or to end their association to protect his own reputation. She made it to the terrace before the tears came, and stood gripping the stone balustrade while trying to control her breathing, while behind her the ballroom buzzed with speculation, and somewhere across London, Alexander remained detained by whatever business had kept him away, unaware that his enemy had found the perfect weapon with which to wound them both. Alexander arrived at Lord Hastings' ball 40 minutes later than intended, with his jaw tight from the deliberate delays Philip had orchestrated through a series of supposed urgent business matters that had proven entirely fabricated, and the moment he entered the ballroom, he knew something had gone catastrophically wrong because Thomas intercepted him with unusual urgency and steered him toward the terrace with words about rumors and Miss Fairfax and Philip's vindictive tongue. He found Clara standing alone in the moonlight, with her white gown seeming to glow against the darkness, and her shoulders rigid with the kind of control that spoke of barely contained devastation. And when she turned at the sound of his footsteps, he saw tears on her cheeks that made fury rise in his chest with an intensity that surprised him with its protective ferocity. "You should not have come out here with me," she said with a composure that broke his heart because he recognized it as the dignity of someone preparing to sacrifice herself for another's benefit. "The rumors will only worsen if we are seen alone again, and I cannot allow you to be trapped by obligation into a connection that will damage your reputation beyond repair." Alexander crossed the terrace in 3 strides and took her hands in his, despite the impropriety, and felt them trembling beneath his touch as he said with absolute clarity that he gave not one damn about rumors or Philip's schemes or society's tedious obsession with scandal. Clara tried to pull away while saying that he did not understand the position Philip had placed him in, that he would be forced either to offer for her from duty or to end their courtship under a cloud of dishonor, and either choice would be a cage constructed by malice. Alexander tightened his grip on her hands and said her name with such tenderness that she went still. And then he spoke the words that had been building in him since the rainstorm, and perhaps even earlier, since the garden party or the theatre, or that first waltz when he had felt the rightness of her in his arms. "I love you," he said, and watched her eyes widen with disbelief that wounded him because she still could not accept that she might be genuinely valued. "I am not trapped by Philip's rumors or society's expectations, Clara. I am only trapped by the terror that you might send me away before I have the chance to prove that every word I speak is true." She shook her head as tears spilled faster and tried to tell him that he could not possibly love her, that he was merely being kind to a woman who had been useful in thwarting an enemy. But Alexander released one of her hands to cup her face with a gentleness that contradicted the intensity burning through him. "You are brilliant and strong and more genuine than anyone I have encountered in 10 years of navigating society's shallow waters," he said against her mouth, before closing the final distance between them in a kiss that held nothing of restraint or propriety, but everything of longing finally unleashed. Clara gasped against his lips, and then responded with a passion that matched his own, her fingers tangling in his cravat and pulling him closer, while the scent of jasmine drifted up from the gardens below, and the sounds of the ball faded into insignificance. Alexander arrived at White's Club at 10 in the morning on May descent, with Thomas at his side and a cold fury burning through him that had replaced the tender passion of the previous evening with something harder and more dangerous, because while he had spent the night alternating between reliving Clara's kiss and planning her protection, Philip had no doubt been congratulating himself on a scheme that would have destroyed a lesser woman's reputation beyond repair. He found Philip in the morning room, surrounded by several gentlemen who fell silent at Alexander's entrance, recognizing in his controlled movements and expressionless face the particular quality of aristocratic rage that preceded social annihilation, and Philip's momentary flash of fear before he assumed a mask of casual indifference told Alexander that his enemy knew precisely why he had come. "I believe you have been spreading rumors about Miss Fairfax," Alexander said with a conversational tone that somehow carried to every corner of the now silent room. "Rumors that suggest impropriety where there was nothing but an accidental encounter during inclement weather, witnessed, I might add, by 3 grooms who can attest to the complete propriety of every moment." Philip rose from his chair with affected boredom and suggested that Alexander was being oversensitive about mere drawing-room chatter, but his voice held an edge of desperation because he understood that he had miscalculated badly by attacking a woman under the protection of a man with Alexander's social power and strategic mind. Alexander took 2 steps closer and said with perfect clarity that Philip would retract every insinuation before the end of the day, or face consequences that would make his current financial difficulties seem trivial by comparison. And the room collectively inhaled because Alexander had just revealed knowledge of Philip's gambling debts that were supposed to be carefully hidden. Philip's face flushed with anger and humiliation as he demanded to know what right Alexander had to threaten him over a woman who had been nobody until 3 weeks ago, and Alexander felt Thomas shift beside him in anticipation of violence, but instead replied that Clara Fairfax had more genuine worth in one honest moment than Philip had displayed in 32 years of shallow existence. Philip, cornered and desperate, made the mistake of challenging Alexander to a duel, perhaps thinking that the Earl would refuse and thus appear cowardly. But Alexander simply smiled without warmth and said that he had no intention of giving Philip the dramatic exit of a dueling ground when social destruction would be far more thorough and permanent. He then proceeded to detail with devastating precision his knowledge of Philip's debts to moneylenders, his cheating at cards the previous autumn, and his pattern of seducing naive young women before abandoning them to damaged reputations, all information Alexander had gathered over years of watching his rival's deterioration. By the time Alexander finished speaking, Philip had gone pale, and every gentleman in the room was looking at him with the particular contempt that society reserved for those who violated the unwritten codes that held their world together. And when Alexander asked one final time whether Philip would retract his rumors, the answer came in a strangled affirmative that sealed Philip's humiliation and Clara's vindication. Alexander arrived at the Fairfax townhouse on the evening of May 50th with his grandmother's emerald ring weighing in his waistcoat pocket like a promise and a terror, because despite his reputation for unshakable composure, he discovered that the prospect of offering his entire future to Clara Fairfax had reduced him to the kind of nervousness he had not experienced since his first speech in the House of Lords at age 23. Margaret Fairfax had received his request for a private audience with Clara with barely concealed triumph, and had retreated upstairs with Eleanor in tow, leaving the drawing-room to Alexander and Clara with only the barest pretense of propriety. And when Clara entered wearing a gown of soft ivory that made her seem luminous, in the lamplight he felt his carefully prepared speech dissolve into incoherence. She looked at him with eyes that held hope and fear in equal measure, and he realized that despite everything he had said and done over the past 3 weeks, she still did not quite believe that he could truly want her as his wife and partner for all the years ahead. "Clara," he began, and then found himself abandoning all the elegant phrases he had rehearsed in favor of simple truth as he crossed to where she stood and took her hands in his with a grip that trembled slightly despite his best efforts at control. "I need to tell you when I first truly saw you, not as a strategy against Philip or as an act of chivalry, but as a woman I recognized with absolute clarity as someone I could love." She started to speak, but he gently touched her lips with his fingers and continued, explaining that it had been in the corridor outside the retiring room at Lady Chamberlain's ball when he had heard Louisa Pembroke's cruel assessment of her desperation, and then watched Clara compose herself with a dignity that had pierced something in his chest he had thought thoroughly armored against sentiment. "You did not rail against the injustice or dissolve into tears or plot petty revenge," he said while studying her face, as though memorizing every detail. "You simply straightened your shoulders and returned to a ballroom that had shown you nothing but dismissal for 6 seasons, and I thought that such strength deserved to be honored rather than overlooked." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she tried to tell him that she was not strong, that she had spent those 6 seasons convinced of her own inadequacy and resigned to invisibility. But Alexander shook his head and said that strength was not the absence of doubt, but the choice to maintain grace despite it. He released her hands and lowered himself to one knee on the drawing-room carpet, while withdrawing the emerald ring from his pocket, watching her expression shift from disbelief to wonder as he spoke the words that would bind their futures together. "Clara Fairfax, will you consent to be my wife? Not because society expects it or because circumstances have forced it, but because I love you with a certainty that has only grown stronger with every conversation we have shared and every moment I have spent in your presence." She looked down at him with tears streaming down her face and whispered that she was 26 years old and plain, and had nothing to offer an earl except a heart that had been his since the moment he had purchased her dance card and changed her entire world. Alexander slipped the emerald ring onto her finger and rose to his feet, while saying that she was brilliant and beautiful, and offering him everything he had not known he was searching for through 10 years of empty social performance. And when she finally breathed the word yes, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with all the joy and relief and promise of their future together. While upstairs, Margaret and Eleanor abandoned all pretense of discretion and rushed down to offer their congratulations. The engagement announcement appeared in the morning papers on May 7th and transformed Clara's existence so completely that she found herself wandering through the Fairfax townhouse in a daze of disbelief, touching the emerald ring on her finger as though confirming its solidity, while Margaret orchestrated a campaign of social triumph that involved accepting 47 calling cards in 2 days and planning an engagement ball that would establish the Fairfax family's elevated position beyond any question. Alexander had insisted on a short engagement of only 6 weeks, despite Margaret's protests that proper preparation required at least 3 months, and Clara understood that his urgency came not from impropriety, but from a desire to claim their future together without the prolonged performance that society demanded, though she also suspected he wanted her safely married before any other obstacle could emerge to threaten their happiness. They spent every acceptable hour together during those weeks, walking in Hyde Park, where society now greeted Clara with deference rather than dismissal, attending the theatre where she sat in his family box as his acknowledged bride, and sharing quiet moments in the Fairfax drawing room where he taught her about the estate she would soon manage beside him, and she revealed the depth of her observations about literature and people that delighted him beyond measure. Eleanor had transformed from embarrassed elder sister to enthusiastic ally and confessed during a private moment that she had never truly known Clara at all, had dismissed her as unremarkable when in truth she possessed a quality of genuine substance that Eleanor was only beginning to understand and value. The engagement ball took place on May 20th at the Fairfax townhouse, which Margaret had decorated with 400 white roses and enough candles to illuminate Clara's happiness for all of London to witness. And when Alexander led her onto the floor for the first waltz she thought of that night at Lady Chamberlain's ball, when she had danced with Philip and felt only the desperate hope of a woman convinced she was invisible. Now she danced with the man who had seen her when no one else bothered to look, who had defended her honor and declared his love, and offered her a future she had stopped allowing herself to imagine during 6 long seasons of resignation, and as they moved through the steps with perfect synchronization, she whispered that she still could not quite believe this was real. Alexander pulled her slightly closer than propriety strictly allowed, and said against her ear that she had 6 weeks to accustom herself to the reality of being loved completely and without reservation, and then a lifetime beyond that to understand that her worth had never depended on society's recognition, but had existed all along, waiting for someone with eyes clear enough to perceive it. Louisa Pembroke attended the ball and offered stiff congratulations that barely masked her confusion at how the social order had rearranged itself so thoroughly, and Philip sent his regrets from his sudden departure to the continent where his debts and damaged reputation would pursue him beyond Alexander's reach. Thomas Sinclair raised a toast to the couple and mentioned with affectionate humor that Alexander had always possessed impeccable judgment in matters of importance, and Clara felt the weight of 6 seasons of invisibility finally lift from her shoulders as she stood beside the man who had purchased her dance card and given her back her future. The wedding took place on June 20th, 1815, in the ancient stone church of St. George, Hanover Square, where generations of aristocratic unions had been blessed, and where Clara walked down the aisle wearing ivory silk and Brussels lace with a confidence that would have astonished the resigned wallflower of 2 months prior, because the woman who placed her hand in Alexander's before the altar knew with absolute certainty that she was loved, not despite her ordinariness, but because he had perceived the extraordinary qualities that society had been too blind to recognize. Eleanor stood as matron of honor and whispered before the ceremony that she had never seen a bride more radiant, and Clara understood that her sister was finally seeing her clearly after years of looking past her toward more socially valuable connections. While Margaret wept openly in the front pew with what appeared to be genuine maternal emotion, though Clara suspected it contained equal parts joy at the advantageous match and relief that her disappointing younger daughter had exceeded all possible expectations. Alexander spoke his vows in a voice that carried through the church with absolute conviction, promising to honor and cherish her through all the years ahead. And when Clara repeated her own promises, she felt the weight of 6 seasons of invisibility finally transform into something precious, because that long, painful education in dignity and resilience had prepared her to recognize genuine love when it appeared, and to value it properly rather than taking it for granted, as she might have done had happiness come easily in her youth. Thomas stood as groomsman and told Clara during the wedding breakfast at Westbrook House that Alexander had been a different man since meeting her, more open and less isolated by the emotional armor that duty and title had required him to wear, and she realized that their union had rescued them both from different forms of loneliness. The wedding breakfast included 200 guests who had dismissed Clara as unremarkable just weeks before, but who now competed to claim acquaintance with the new Countess of Westbrook, and she moved through the celebration with grace, while privately marveling at how quickly social opinion could shift when a powerful man declared a woman valuable. Louisa Pembroke attended and offered congratulations that seemed almost sincere, as though witnessing Clara's transformation had taught her something about the arbitrary nature of the hierarchies she had spent years defending, and Clara accepted her good wishes with generous dignity because she understood that cruelty often came from fear of one's own inadequacy. As afternoon faded toward evening, Alexander took her hand and led her away from the celebration toward the carriage that would carry them to his estate in Derbyshire, where they would spend 3 weeks away from society's demands. And as they drove through London streets toward their future together, Clara looked at the emerald ring on her finger and thought of that desperate woman by the potted palms who had believed herself unworthy of notice. Alexander seemed to sense her thoughts because he lifted her hand to his lips and said that every moment of loneliness she had endured had been leading her toward this beginning, and she leaned against his shoulder while watching the city disappear behind them and understanding that sometimes the longest wait yields the most precious arrival. The estate in Derbyshire became their sanctuary during those 3 weeks away from London's scrutiny, and Clara discovered that marriage to Alexander meant not simply acquiring a title and position, but entering into a partnership of genuine companionship, where her observations about estate management were valued, and her presence in his library was welcomed, and her happiness became his primary concern, beyond even the demands of duty that had governed his life before she entered it. They walked through the grounds each morning while he showed her the tenant farms and introduced her to families who had served the Thornhill estate for generations, and she understood that becoming countess meant accepting responsibility for the welfare of hundreds of people whose livelihoods depended on the stewardship she and Alexander would provide together. The nights belonged to the discovery of physical intimacy that transformed her understanding of what marriage could mean, and she learned that the care and patience Alexander showed in all aspects of their relationship extended to the marriage bed, where he taught her that her pleasure mattered as much as his own, and that the connection between them deepened with each vulnerable moment they shared in the darkness of their chamber. On their final evening before returning to London, they sat together in the library where she had spent many happy afternoon hours reading while he attended to correspondence, and he asked if she felt ready to face society again as his countess with all the visibility and expectation that position required. Clara considered the question seriously, while watching firelight play across the books that lined the walls, and thinking of the woman she had been just 10 weeks earlier, standing by the potted palms in lavender silk and believing herself permanently invisible. And she realized that Alexander had not simply rescued her from obscurity, but had given her the gift of recognizing her own worth, independent of society's validation. She told him that she was ready, not because she had transformed into someone different, but because she finally understood that she had always possessed value, even when no one bothered to see it. And his love had taught her to perceive herself clearly, rather than through the dismissive lens of social judgment that had convinced her she was unremarkable. Alexander pulled her close and said that wisdom was exactly why he loved her, because she possessed the intelligence to understand that their story was not about a powerful man elevating a nobody, but about two people finding each other, despite the artificial barriers that society constructed to keep individuals confined within narrow definitions of worth. They returned to London on July 15th and began their life together as Earl and Countess of Westbrook, navigating the social season with the confidence of a partnership built on genuine recognition and love, and Clara never again stood invisible by the potted palms because she carried within herself the knowledge that she had always been worthy of notice, and it was society that had been blind rather than she who had been lacking. And sometimes late at night, when Alexander held her close, she whispered gratitude for the evening he had seen her clearly, and purchased her dance card, and given her back the future she had resigned herself to living without, and he always replied in that she had given him something equally precious by teaching him that true value lay not in title or position, but in the quality of character that she possessed in abundance, and that he would spend their lifetime together honoring the extraordinary woman that society had been foolish enough to overlook.